At the beginning of July 2026, Ukrainian drones found 6 of the 7 Hardened aircraft shelters at Saki Air Base in occupied Crimea. They blew the doors off 4 of them. And that same base had already been hit once just days before. Russia had spent real money reinforcing that airfield with concrete shelters built specifically to stop this kind of strike. Within a single week, Ukraine ran the experiment twice and got through both times. Every outlet covering the war ran some version of that story. But we want to make the case today that the hangar fire is the least interesting part of what's actually happening to Russian air power right now. Because underneath the footage of collapsing shelter doors is a second campaign that gets almost no coverage at all. One being fought in export ledgers, sanction lists, and corporate earnings statements. And that second campaign may end up mattering more than any single strike. Ukraine isn't just destroying Russian jets one at a time on a taxiway in Crimea. It's making it structurally harder for Russia to ever build the next one. So let's get into it, starting with setting the scene. Saki, more properly Novofedorivka Air Base, has been home to the Russian Navy's 43rd Independent Naval Attack Aviation Regiment since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It's been used to deploy Su-30SM and Su-30M multi-role fighters, aircraft used for naval strike missions. But it's also been increasingly used for glide bomb runs against southern Ukraine. For most of the war, it functioned as a relatively secure rear base, far enough from the front line that Russia treated it as a safe place to park, service, and rearm aircraft. But in July 2026, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, started launching drone strikes against the base's hangar infrastructure and reported 5 confirmed hits, with preliminary information placing Su-30 and Su-30SM fighters inside 2 of the targeted hangars and a fire breaking out where one of those aircraft was stored. The SBU's own valuation put each of those aircraft at somewhere between $30 and $50 million, depending on configuration. 2 days later, the SBU struck again, this time claiming hits on 7 hangars across the base, with Su-30SM, Su-30, and Su-24 aircraft reportedly inside several of them. The SBU claimed at least 7 aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Apart from Saki, Ukraine also hit the Gwardyske or Gwardyskoye Air Base, roughly 30 kilometers inland, striking 2 more hangars storing Shahed drones and aviation support equipment. What makes these strikes different from most of the airfield hits we've covered over the past years is that we don't have to rely on Ukrainian government claims alone to know what happened. Satellite imagery from Vantor, a commercial satellite company, independently confirmed the damage. 6 of the 7 Hardened aircraft shelters showed visible damage. The blast doors on 4 of them were no longer attached, but lying out on the taxiway. The shelter themselves, which were reinforced concrete structures, are still mostly standing. But a Hardened aircraft shelter is exactly designed to survive a near miss and keep the aircraft inside flyable. What the Saki Imagery shows is a structure that held its shape, while everything that mattered inside it, and the door that was supposed to seal it, didn't survive. This means Russia's answer to Ukraine's mid to long-range threat of drones, which so far is just poured concrete, is already being tested in the field less than a year after it went up, and it isn't holding the way Russian planners hoped. Here's the timeline that explains why those shelters exist at all. In June 2025, Ukraine launched the famous Operation Spiderweb, a mass drone strike deep inside Russian territory against strategic bomber bases, using drones that had been smuggled into position over months and launched from inside Russia itself. Ukraine claimed hits on dozens of aircraft at bases including Belaya, more than 4,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Since then, Ukrainian regular long-range strikes have reached as far as Engels, roughly 600 kilometers from the front. Now, before Spiderweb, Russian air defense planning had assumed that distance itself was a form of protection. If Ukraine couldn't physically reach an airfield, the aircraft parked on it were safe, full stop, no further investment required. But Ukraine showed that it could reach some of the most remote corners of Russia, either by piloting drones or delivering them in deep cover operations. And Russia's response was to start pouring concrete at airfields that had previously used open ramps, treating hardened shelters as the fix for a threat that open-air parking could no longer survive. On paper, the protection had merit. If you reinforce the position, you protect the assets inside and buy back some survivability through structure. The problem is that Ukraine's strike drones adapted faster than Russia could finish building. The strikes show that Ukraine's newer drone systems are specifically chipping away at the protective value those shelters were supposed to provide. And 6 out of 7 shelters damaged in a single week at one base is exactly the kind of evidence that supports that claim. So Russia solved one problem, which was exposed aircraft on open airfields, and in doing so created a new one. That being expensive, obvious and fixed structures that Ukraine now knows exactly where to find and how to blow up from the inside out. To understand why this matters beyond the value of the airframes themselves, we need to talk about what a hangar actually is, because most coverage of these strikes treats the story as simply a body count of destroyed jets, and that undersells what's actually being attacked. A fighter jet is not a standalone weapon, it's the visible tip of an entire support system, and that system is what determines how much combat power an airfield can actually generate on any given day, a concept called sortie generation. The hangar is where the labor-intensive part of that cycle happens. Engines get inspected, avionics get tested and calibrated, weapons get loaded onto hardpoints. All of that depends on trained mechanics, spare parts inventories, ground support equipment, fuel lines, diagnostic test equipment, and maintenance paperwork. And all of that needs to sit in one physical location for it to be applied to the actual aircraft. And in 2026, a drone can reach it. Ukraine doesn't need to put a $50 million Su-30SM on the ground to reduce what that aircraft contributes to the war. It just needs to make the sortie generation cycle at that base slower, more expensive, and less reliable than it was the week before. Damage the maintenance bay and repairs stall. Destroy the ground support gear, and a perfectly fiable aircraft sits idle because nobody can arm or fuel it properly. Knock out radar or air defense coverage around the field, and the next drone strike arrives with less resistance than the last one did. An aircraft that can't be deployed on a sortie is that day exactly as useful to Russia as an aircraft that doesn't exist. That's also why Ukraine keeps hitting the same handful of airfields in Crimea over and over, instead of chasing a bigger single kill count somewhere else. Ukraine knows where the bulk of Russia's glide strikes are coming from, so it's going for them precisely to reduce how much offensive Russia can actually output on any given day. But there's a broader operational logic behind why Ukraine is hitting so many different target types at once. It's a concept called parallel operations, and it comes directly out of US Air Force doctrine, which was the same logic that underpinned coalition air campaigns against Iraq. The idea is simple. A sequential campaign hits one target, waits, assesses the damage, and then moves to the next target. But a parallel campaign hits many parts of the enemy system at the same time, including airfields, fuel depots, radar sites, air defense batteries, rail nodes, ammunition storage, maintenance facilities, and command infrastructure, all within the same window or as close to simultaneous as available strike capacity allows. The goal here is what's called systemic shock. When an adversary has to respond to problems appearing everywhere at once, it can't concentrate its repair and defense resources on any single one of them. Decisions get made with incomplete information. Resources get pulled in competing directions across the country. The whole system starts operating slower and worse, everywhere and all at once. Ukraine is running a version of this with drones, missiles, and special operations sabotage, but obviously without the scale of the US Air Force. However, the underlying logic is identical. Saki gets hit twice in 1 week, then Guardisca gets hit the same night as the second strike. Meanwhile, Russian refineries burn in the same stretch of a few weeks. Russia can't mass its air defense and repair response against any single problem, because there are too many simultaneous problems competing for the same limited pool of engineers, spare parts, and air defense batteries. The side that forces its opponent into permanent reactive mode while it stays in the driver's seat tends to win the attrition fight over time, even without winning any individual engagement decisively. Now, here's where we need to zoom out, because the airfield strikes are only half the picture. While Ukrainian drones have been grinding through hangars in Crimea, a second and quieter campaign has been degrading Russia's ability to replace what it loses. That campaign is being fought almost entirely by Western export control regimes, sanctioned supply chains, and Russia's own defense industrial arithmetic. Let's put some numbers on the airframe losses first, because they set up why replacement capacity matters so much. The open-source tracking project Oryx, which only counts losses it can visually confirm through photographic or video evidence, has documented at least 43 Su-34 fighter bombers and at least 21 Su-30 series aircraft lost or damaged between the start of the war and June 2026. And because Oryx requires a visual confirmation for every single entry, these numbers are a floor, not a ceiling, so the real total is almost certainly higher. Against a pre-war Su-34 fleet, estimated at roughly 163 aircraft, confirmed losses alone account for a quarter of that entire inventory. And that's all before counting airframes pulled from service for damage, overdue maintenance, or crew shortages, none of which show up in a visual confirmation loss tracker. By June 2026, Russia's total confirmed aircraft losses across all fixed-wing types sat around 185, with broader tallies including all combat aircraft types running at least double that once helicopters and secondary losses are folded in. In fact, as early as 2024, RAND estimated that Russia's air force had already fallen to roughly 75% of its pre-war strength due to accelerated wear and aircraft nearing the end of their service life, and the losses haven't stopped accumulating since. This is the environment Russia's aircraft industry is supposed to be replacing losses into, and that's where things get genuinely bad for Moscow. But before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We follow both recent events and provide long-term and historical analytics that show exactly how the war is faring on both sides. Back to Russia's troubles. Let's start with the crown jewel program of the VVS, the Su-57 Felon, a fifth-generation stealth fighter that's been in development for nearly 2 decades and was supposed to be a direct answer to the F-35. In 2023, Russia's United Aircraft Corporation, UAC, delivered a reported 11 Su-57s to the aerospace forces, and its CEO publicly pledged to double production going forward. Instead, deliveries went the other direction. In 2024, the most corroborated estimate was 5 aircraft delivered against a target of 22. And UAC ended all of 2025 without a single officially confirmed delivery of a new Su-57 to the Russian aerospace forces. Analysts did spot images in the spring of 2025 suggesting 2 aircraft, tail numbers Red 25 and Red 26, but even that was speculative because Rostec never officially announced it, which is itself telling. A defense contractor confident in its production ramp publishes numbers, timelines, and identifiable batches. Russia's Su-57 program has instead gone quiet, publishing fragments and letting speculation fill the silence. But there might be a simple reason for that. The UK think tank Sortie published a research paper titled in November 2025, Vulnerabilities in Sukhoi Production, Clipping Russia's Wings. In it suggested that Russia's primary assembly plants at Komsomolsk on Amur, Novosibirsk and Irkutsk were already under direct sanctions. However, it also noted that a significant number of their second and third tier suppliers, the companies making titanium airframe components, engine parts and radar systems, have managed to avoid restrictions so far, which Sortie flagged as an active gap in the current sanctions regime rather than evidence that the vulnerability doesn't exist. But Sortie's mapping showed that the most critical suppliers, including the engine manufacturer UEC, UMPO and UFA, titanium supplier VSMPO, Avisma, and radar manufacturer Ryazan State Instrument Making Enterprise, all sit inside the European part of Russia, within range of Ukraine's growing long-range strike capability. In other words, the same strike logic currently being applied to hangars in Crimea has a second, even more consequential target set sitting largely unsanctioned and within reach further north. The bottlenecks compound. The Su-57 was designed around a next-generation engine known as Izdeliye 30, but the aircraft has spent years flying with a transitional engine from the older AL-41 family, while the newer engine struggled to provide stable performance. A modern stealth fighter's entire operational promise, its thermal signature, its sensor performance, its ability to supercruise, is tied to that final engine configuration, and manufacturers are understandably reluctant to commit to mass production of a plane whose core power plant hasn't been finalized. When you layer the aforementioned sanctions-driven component shortages on top of that unfinished engine transition, you get exactly the pattern we're seeing. Aircraft that exist, that fly, that get rolled out for the occasional publicity flight, but that can't be put into the kind of steady, predictable production run that actually replaces combat losses. Open source estimates put per unit Su-57 costs somewhere between $50 and $100 million, depending on configuration, and in a wartime economy, the more easily produced Su-34 and Su-35S deliver more immediate combat value for their cost. So Russian planners appear to be doing exactly what the arithmetic tells them to, deprioritizing the expensive sanctions-choked prestige program in favor of aircraft they can actually get out of the door, even if those simpler aircraft are also being lost faster. And even the money to fix any of this is getting harder to find. In November 2025 at the Dubai Air Show, Rostec CEO Sergei Chemezov confirmed publicly that Russian defense exports have fallen by roughly half compared to 2022 levels. He attributed the drop to wartime production being redirected almost entirely toward the Russian military itself rather than foreign buyers. Before the invasion, Russia was earning something like 1.1 trillion rubles, about $14 billion a year in arms export revenue, and stood as the world's second largest arms exporter behind only the US. The Jamestown Foundation's independent analysis suggested the real collapse is even steeper than Chemezov's own framing suggests, estimating a 92% drop in exports between 2021 and 2024 alone. The report indicates a combination of redirected wartime production, sanctions, inflation, and foreign buyers, including traditionally reliable customers like India, actively turning toward other suppliers. And according to figures from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, Russia's overall share of the global arms export market has fallen from 21% to just under 7% over 5 years. This is an unprecedented collapse for a country that spent decades as one of the top 3 arms exporters on Earth and which has built substantial diplomatic influence in the global South, specifically through those weapons relationships. But this isn't just an export story anymore, as it's showing up in the core financials. In July 2026, Rostec disclosed that its net profit fell 42% in 2025, even as revenue rose 25% on the back of higher domestic wartime orders. In one report, Chemezov himself told Russia's prime minister that the company didn't have much of its own capital left to fund new investment projects. How is that possible? Simply put, the government's programs are being essentially forced upon Rostec to be accepted at significantly lower margins than programs designed for export. Domestic procurement contracts appear to offer significantly lower profit margins than export contracts. It's telling that the country that started a war now doesn't want to spend the money to get quality military gear that could actually help end it and is trying to attrit with older tech. Put those two campaigns next to each other and the result is obvious. Ukraine is destroying Russian combat aircraft, degrading the hangars, fuel, and ground support infrastructure that generate sorties from the aircraft that survive, and doing all of it inside a broader parallel operations campaign designed to overload Russian repair and defense capacity everywhere at once. At the same time, Western sanctions, export losses, and Russia's own wartime resource allocation are strangling the industrial base that's supposed to replace every one of those losses. Those two pressures reinforce each other in a positive feedback loop. Every hardened shelter Russia pours concrete for, and every partially sanctioned supplier still quietly shipping titanium and radar components into that supply chain, is an obvious next target for the same drones that took the doors off 6 shelters at Saki. Rusi's recommendation from the report mentioned earlier ties all this together. The West needs to expand sanctions coverage to those second and third tier suppliers, precisely because that's where the exploitable gap currently sits. Meanwhile, every additional export contract Russia loses because a buyer like India walks toward a more reliable supplier is one less source of money Moscow could otherwise use to fund the exact kind of accelerated production Rusi warns is already faltering. This is the compounding mechanism that makes the Crimea airfield campaign matter more than its body count suggests. Ukraine doesn't need to win a war of attrition against Russia's existing aircraft inventory in isolation. It needs Russian losses to keep outpacing a replacement pipeline that sanctions, lost export revenue, and a supply chain scattered across sanctioned and unsanctioned suppliers alike, already struggling to sustain on their own with no outside pressure required. None of this means Russian air power over Crimea collapses on a fixed timeline, and we want to be careful not to overstate where this actually goes. Russia still has one of the largest industrial bases in the world. It can still design airframes, forge titanium structures, and integrate weapon systems domestically. And it's demonstrated the ability to adapt and innovate throughout this war, including opening new dedicated facilities for fuel systems and avionics testing. Even Saki itself can be rebuilt, re-equipped, and re-sheltered if Moscow decides to prioritize it the way it's rebuilt bases before. And parallel operations, by their nature, only work if the side running them can sustain the tempo. Ukraine's drone production, while real and growing, is competing against a Russian air defense network around Crimea that's also being reinforced and adapted specifically in response to these exact strikes. Strike accuracy itself can degrade if Russian jamming and electronic warfare improve faster than Ukraine's targeting systems do. What the Saki strikes and the industrial data do tell us, though, is the direction of travel, and that direction has been remarkably consistent for more than a year. Russia keeps solving yesterday's vulnerability, and Ukraine keeps finding the next one, whether that's a newer strike drone that defeats Concrete or a Western sanctions list that hasn't caught up to a specific supplier. Concrete didn't save Russia's jets at Saki, it just made the problem slightly more photogenic on satellite imagery. And the problem with the Su-57 isn't solely on production, but how it actually fares in the air. To learn more, check out this video. And as always, make sure to subscribe to get daily updates on the most pressing issues in global geopolitics and warfare.